All right, it is September 7th. This is our second lesson on the promises and prophecies of the Bible. We are starting out with where we left off, which would be Genesis, the end of 11, beginning of 12, really. And we've got, we've had the great flood, and Noah's three sons were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the line that we're going to follow is Shem. That's the bloodline of Christ that Jesus came through. And you'll see at the end of chapter 11, verses 10 through 26, it gives all the descendants of Shem, from Shem down to Abram. And an interesting, with the updated genealogy, we talked last time that Adam lived 930 years, and with the exception of Noah, Noah's father, Lamech, lived to be 777 years. So you can see that the life line is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, which goes back to Adam's sin. So with this genealogy that's given in the end of chapter 11, Shem lived 600 years, and when you get down to Abram, which turns into Abraham, he only lived 175 years. So that's a really quick decrease in the longevity of man in just those few generations. I mean, we have people that live to be over 100 years now. So as sin and disease and things enter into the world, man's lifetime span is getting shorter and shorter. Something interesting at the end of 11, and when I was preparing for the lesson again today, it hit me. I think I'm correct, which I never have noticed this little piece before, but it talks about Terah's descendant, Terah. It's a man. It's Abram's father. He had three sons, Abram, which ends up being Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran is the father of Lot. And it says Haran died. We don't know what that means. It says Haran died in the presence of his father. We don't know what of. And it says Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, which is going to be Sarah eventually. And the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah. And then it goes on to say that daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Isk. So that means that Nahor married his niece, because Milcah was the daughter of Haran, and Haran was his brother. I had not noticed that before.
Yeah.
And then it says Sarai was barren, she had no child. And then it says that Terah, so Abram's father, took Abram and Lot, this son of Haran that has died, so it'd be his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law. But it doesn't say what happened with Nahor. He just falls off the face of the earth, and we don't hear, I don't think, anything about him through the rest of the Bible. So I don't know why Terah took Abraham and this son of his other son, but his third son, he just leaves him somewhere. I don't know. So we'll never know, but it was just an interesting fact. So they go to the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, I guess named after a son, I don't know, they ended up they were going to go to Canaan, but they settled in this land of Haran. And Terah dies there. And now we turn our focus to Abram in chapter 12. And starts right out with, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. That's promise 1. I'll bless you, promise 2. I'll make your name great, promise 3, and you'll be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So there's a lot of blessings or promises in this, what they call the Abrahamic covenant. But the very first thing is, this is a conditional promise that he says, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. He tells him to go alone. Abraham doesn't do what God asked him to do, and he takes Lot with him, this nephew, which is not what God said to do. He said to leave his kindred.
Yeah.
He didn't leave his kindred. He took Lot, which ends up being trouble for Abraham, as we'll find out shortly. So he leaves Haran, and he heads out to the land of Canaan. And when they got there, he builds an altar, which is common practice back then. But he says, I'll give you this land. That's in verses 6 through 9. He talks to him about this land that he's going to give them. And this is repeated over and over to Abraham and his descendants. So anyway, he takes off in chapters 13. He's heads out with Lot, which is not what God said. And he went up from Egypt with his wife and all that he had, and Lot, and they went into the Negeb. And Abraham, it says, was rich, livestock, silver, gold. So anyway, he's carrying on his little trek to the land of Canaan. And in chapter 13, verses 14 to 18, the Lord says to Abram again, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward. For all the land you see, I'll give to you and to your offspring forever. So we don't have specific boundaries at this point. The one piece of scripture says it's from the river of Egypt. Are they talking about the Nile or another one? To the, oh dear, what was the other boundary?
Where was that verse?
Oh, it's from, he tells him to go from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. Let me go back and find that.
Oh, there it is. No.
I didn't make it up, I promise.
At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. I missed the verse about.
Let me pull it up again. Bear with me, people. Sorry.
Oh. Okay. An alliance of 4 eastern kings was defeated by Abraham's small forces. Well, no, that's chapter 14, darn it. Oh, the promise of 12:7 is renewed. Mamre was an ancient sacred place slightly north of Hebron, or Hebron, whichever you prefer, with which Adam was associated.
Well, maybe at this point he hasn't told him where that is. I read that in my notes, that it was from that river to river, which
Maybe it's out farther.
which he called it north and south, but when you look at a map, it's east and west. But
Yeah, well,
God said to the north, it's the Euphrates, and to the south, it's the river
of Egypt.
of Egypt.
Well, the Euphrates is northeast of Egypt, and Egypt's to the southwest, so consider this. Perhaps the earth had shifted on its axis.
He gets more specific about this later, but at this point, that's all we know. But from the river of Egypt, again, if we're talking about the Nile, and we don't know that, there could be a smaller river. But even if you take it from the border of Egypt, you're still saying that God is promising him Jordan, I think Lebanon, current day Israel,
Syria.
Syria, a piece of Iraq at least, possibly a piece of Saudi Arabia. So that's still more than what the nation of Israel owns at this time, today, currently in 2021. But again, as this goes on through Abraham's life and to Abraham's descendants, God gets more specific about where those boundaries are. So just have to stay tuned. In Genesis 13, then verses 14 to 18, the Lord tells Abram again, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward, for all the land that you see I'll give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth. Now again, he hasn't had any children at this point. He's getting old. Sarah's old. But he's telling him he's going to have as many offspring as the dust of the earth. That's a lot. So that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent, and he came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. And there he built an altar again. So this is twice that God has said, I'm giving you this land. We move into chapter 14. Abram, Lot ends up being the problem child. He ends up settling what he thinks is the choicest land. He takes Sodom and Gomorrah because it's the richest as far as fertile soil. But that ends badly as God destroyed those, and Abram has to rescue him. So, see, if he'd left him home, he wouldn't have had that problem. Then in chapter 15, verses 1 to 7, so he tells him again, blessed be Abram. Well, this high priest this Melchizedek comes, and in verses 1 to 7 of chapter 15, Lord comes to Abram in a vision, and he again says, Abram says, you've given me no offspring, and God keeps telling me I'm going to have this heir, but I don't have an heir. And God told him to go out and look up toward the heaven and number the stars if you're able to number them, and so shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. So this is the third time now that he's promised him to have these great offspring when he has none. And he again tells him in verse 7, I brought you from the Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. So again, this is the third time he's told him about the land. And so he has this whole vision where he makes a sacrifice again with Abram. He goes to sleep. At the end of this, though, in chapter 13, he says, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. so he's given him this promise of this land, but now he's telling them they're going to be slaves for 400 years. And so he's made this covenant now with him, with this ceremony, with this sacrificing of the birds and walking through them and all that. We're not going to go into all that, but he's now made this a covenant promise with Abraham, which is, this is like taking it from a pinky swear to a blood oath. So then we get into chapter 16.
Wait a minute. I like in chapter 14, verse, I don't know, like 17 through 20, he brought him into the king's valley, the valley of Sheba, and King Melchizedek of Salem brought out the bread and the wine. I just thought of that as a prophecy, just bringing out the bread and the wine, because then later that becomes Elijah's cup, and later that's the cup that Jesus uses at the Last Supper.
Right, and the Salem is
Salem
the same
is
as Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's all very interesting. Yeah.
So now we're in chapter 16, and we have the waters get muddy because, again, humans think we know better than what God does. And so because he's not had this child, Sarai gets the bright idea that culture back in that time would allow for your servant to bear a child and it becomes her. So she convinces Abraham to sleep with this maidservant, and Abraham says yes. And so this maidservant has a son, and they name him Ishmael, and that counts as Abram's first son for sure, but that's supposed to be like it's Sarai's son. But Hagar, the maidservant, and Sarai now start getting into fussing. And so Sarai says, send her away. I don't want that child. So that becomes a whole issue. But Ishmael is promised. I'm getting ahead of myself. But anyway, so they go out in the desert, and God says no, go back. And so there's this whole big rigmarole between Hagar, her son Ishmael, and Sarai, and not having a son. And God again says, you're going to have a son. Knock it off. So in chapter 17, verses 1 to 8, is when Abram gets a name change to be Abraham. And again, he refers to this covenant that you'll be the father of a multitude of nations in verse 4. No longer shall your name called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Now again, he doesn't have one offspring at this point. I will make you exceedingly fruitful. I'll make you into nations. Kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout the generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojourning. So again, here's the land, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So again, I think this is the fourth time that he's promised these same things to Abraham, and we're still waiting for the child to come along.
Now, Ishmael is the ancestor of Muhammad, is he not?
He's
because I think that's an interesting point to bring up.
Yeah,
even though it doesn't become clear.
Right, and I'll get to that.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. You're fine.
The gun.
That's okay. I jumped the gun on myself. Verses 9 through 14. Another covenant comes through, and that's circumcision for Abraham and all these descendants. And then he says again, 19 to 22 verses, that Sarah will have a son. He reiterates that yet again. And then we go on, chapter 18, chapter 19, chapter 20. Let me ask you a
question on the circumcision, because you're a nurse. I was always told that the reason they circumcised, or God instructed them to circumcise, and then they did, was because there used to be lots of infections in uncircumcised foreskins. It was a source of infection.
Doesn't ever say that in the Bible. It was done as a visible symbol that they were different, set apart and unique.
Oh, okay. Cool.
So we go clear over to chapter 21 before Isaac is born. Verses 1 to 6, we talk about Isaac, and then verses 8 to 13, we go back and we see Ishmael again. So he's like a teenager at this point. Where am I? Yeah. So he says that he will be a great nation too. In verse 13, and I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. He is the firstborn. That set the stage for all this conflict that we've had between Muhammad's descendants is Islam, and Abraham's descendants, the Jews, and ultimately us then, eventually as Christians, is that historically, typically, the firstborn is the one that gets the birthright. And so Ishmael's descendants, Muslims, claim that all these promises to Abraham were theirs because their direct line, it was the firstborn. And firstborn should get all that. And of course, that's not what God said. And so it set up this conflict. And so it has become a great nation. We see that. But again, it could have all been avoided if they had followed God's plan and not tried to got in there and messed it up by having Hagar have this child. I did try to look at who are the, because in we're skipping way over now, we're getting faster. In Genesis 25, verses 12 to 18, it actually says, these are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, who Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the son of Ishmael and the order of their birth. And it goes through those, and they're 12. Just like Isaac, there's 12 tribes of Israel. There's 12 tribes of Ishmael. And I tried to do research on who are these 12 tribes of Ishmael, and all I can find is that it's current day Arabs, but we don't have the detail of these 12 tribes like we do the details of the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. So I did try to find that. It's like a great secret. I mean, they're Arabs, but we don't know any more than that. And then in chapter 26, verses 1 to 6, Abraham has died. Now we have Isaac, and there's a famine, and he was going to go to Egypt because of this famine, and God says don't go there in 26 verse 2. And in verse 3 it says, sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and will bless you. For you, to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your offsprings as the stars of heaven, and I will give to your offspring all these lands. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So the Abrahamic covenant has passed to Isaac, his son, the next generation, and he reiterates the same promises. I'll be with you. I'll bless you. I'll give the land. God will carry out the Abrahamic covenant. I'll give the land to your descendants, and I'll make gets a little bit more specific. I'll make one of your descendants a blessing to the whole earth. Well, we know that because we know the end of the story, that he's talking about Jesus Christ the Messiah. But they don't know that back then.
Tell me that verse again. I'm sorry, I lost.
That's okay.
Lost my place.
26 verses 1 to 6. I'll have to see.
Okay. It's in like 5 and 6. I will make
Yeah.
your offspring. Yeah.
So,
I got lost because Esau and Jacob were already born.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, well, I can't have missed that. But
yeah.
I did.
So, as Marilyn just said, the two nations of Jacob, who are the two nations of Jacob and Esau? Esau married one of Ishmael's daughters. So, we've commingled this Abrahamic line and this Ishmael Muslim line. Again, that's not a good thing. We've muddied the waters, which again makes them feel like those people especially say, I have a claim to God's promises, because you've got Esau that is of this Abrahamic descent of Isaac, who has this promise, and you've got Jacob, who is also of that same line. But you'll find out later that Jacob is the one that Isaac blesses on his deathbed, and not Esau. I think, although Esau, I believe, is the oldest.
That's right.
But Esau married one of Ishmael's daughters and co-founded the Edomites. So anytime you see the Edomites, is this line of Esau, and they're a mixture of the lineages of Abraham and through Ishmael. So again, we muddy the waters with, that's why all the fighting is over in the Middle East, because they're all fighting over this land and the promises. And you can see how it kind of makes sense based on the laws of the land at the time, but it's not what God said. So now we skip over to Genesis 28, and again, we're going to see that this promise passes to Jacob, not Esau. In chapter 28, verses 6 is where I'm talking about that Esau marries an Ishmaelite. Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Paddan Aram to take a wife from there. And that as he blessed him, he directed, you must not take a wife from the Canaanite women. And that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother, and he went to the Paddan Aram. So when Esau saw that the Canaanite women did not please Isaac his father, he went to Ishmael and took as his wife, besides the wives he had. So not only did he marry an Ishmaelite, Ishmael descendant, he has polygamy, he has multiple wives. So, what a stupid revenge, to get back at your parents. I'm just going to go over here and marry this woman that I know that you won't like. But
yeah.
Jacob, on his trip to go get this wife, has a dream, and in verses 13 to 15, God promises again. So since Abraham, I think this is the 5th time now that we've had this same promise. I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And then he woke up and said, surely the Lord is in this place. And so he marks that land with a pillar the next day, and they call it Bethel. So,
I wonder if Luz means light, because it means light in several languages. My Bible doesn't say. The name of Bethel was Luz at the first.
Oh.
It doesn't say.
Yeah. I don't have anything in my stuff
Bible
either.
does say that Bethel is the northern sanctuary.
So from Genesis 29 through 34, we're going to skip through all that. this just talks about Jacob having his 12 sons. They become the 12 tribes of Israel. And then in chapter 35, verses 9 to 13, Jacob's name is changed to Israel. And that's why we now call them the nation of Israel from then on, is from this point of verse 9 through 13. God appeared to Jacob when he came from Paddan Aram. So he was on his way to Paddan Aram, remember, and he had this dream and a vision, and God promised him this. Now he's on his way back. And he says, your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel, and God said to him, 6th time, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. The land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him, and Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured out a drink offering, poured oil on it. So Jacob called the name of the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. Doesn't say anything about the Luz this time. So, again, 6 times now, God has promised land, blessings, and
Nation, mighty
and
nation.
a mighty nation, lots of people.
And kings shall spring from you.
Yeah. So if you go over to chapter 37, verses 5 to 11. Well, wait a minute. I skipped over Joseph.
Oh, yeah, we have to go back to Joseph first.
Yeah. So Jacob has sons, and he was married to the wrong woman. His father-in-law tricked him and gave him the wrong woman. So Jacob ends up with 2 wives, and he loves Rachel, and he tolerates Leah. But Leah's the one that's giving him all the sons, and Rachel isn't having any children. So they battle back and forth, but they end up having 12 sons. So just like Ishmael had 12 tribes, we now have 12 tribes of Israel, but these are the real 12 tribes of Israel. So one of those sons is Joseph. And Joseph is the first son that Israel, Jacob, had with Rachel. So he really loves Joseph. He's not the firstborn, but he is.
Rachel was barren for a long, long time.
So